Okay, we are now ready to begin going through the questions on the pre-comprehensive makeup exam quiz. And as with the review for the final, I'm not going to go through these as fast as I can. I'm going to use it as a way to use each question as a way to review the concepts that you need to understand. So I'm going to go through these things more slowly than you would be able to do on the exam. And just be patient. If you'll take your time and watch these videos, you will end up with a better understanding of the things you need to know to do well on that makeup exam. So let's begin with question number 1. And again, look at, as we go through these, notice the process that I use in answering these questions. Look for important words, look for keywords, reread when you need to, think about what the graphs mean, okay? All right, number 1, refer to the set of 4 panels in the figure. Which panel shows the typical shape of the average cost curve in a competitive industry? Okay. And just think about these 4 graphs. On every one, you've got the quantity on the horizontal, you've got the a dollar measure of cost on the vertical axis. Some people just have trouble with what does a curve mean? Well, a curve, a line, is showing you a relationship between the 2 variables. And what you have, let's look at B first. It's horizontal, okay? So that means that if the firm is not producing very much, their marginal cost is going to be here. Okay? Say $5 per unit. If they're producing significantly more, $5. Even more, $5. That horizontal line means the marginal cost is the same, no matter how many units they're producing. What does panel D mean? Ask yourself that question. Negatively sloped curve. What does that tell you? It tells you as the quantity is increasing, what's happening to the cost? The cost is coming down. There's an inverse relationship between the quantity and the cost. Here we're talking about average cost. Okay. Panel C, note you can see as the firm is producing more, average cost is getting higher and higher. Okay. Well, think about what did we say when we talked about average cost? We said that it will tend to look like that. And remember what that means. It means when the firm is small, producing only a low output, its average cost will tend to be relatively high. Okay, every firm is going to have some fixed cost, and so if they're only producing 1 unit of output, their average fixed cost is going to be very high. As they expand and they produce more, their average cost tends to go down because they're spreading that fixed cost over a larger number of units. At some point, you hit the bottom of that curve. That is the quantity at which average cost is at a minimum. We said that over this range of output here, where average cost is declining with quantity, what did we say the firm is experiencing? It's experiencing economies of scale. Just means as you produce more, average cost decline. If the firm continues to expand, then the firm's average costs start to go up. Okay, we said that is when that happens, the firm is said to be experiencing diseconomies of scale. Okay, because of their output continuing to go up, their average cost has started to go up as well. So panel A would be the cost curve, average cost curve that we expect in most markets, and especially in a competitive market. The only or the main exception to that would be where you have a natural monopoly, which means that no matter how much output the firm produces, average cost keeps getting lower and lower and lower. Um, um, Utilities often are natural monopolies. Water production or water distribution in a community, electricity generation, things like that. Okay, so A is what we would expect. Moving on to number 2. Here we have which of the areas in this figure represents the deadweight loss resulting from a $2 tax. We said you have a deadweight loss when something happens. It can be due to a tax, it can be due to a tariff, it can be due to monopoly. Something happens that prevents us from reaching the efficient level of output. And as a result, potential gains from trade that we could have had, we lose. And that's what we're going to see here. We have and as you look at a question like this, you first look at the graph and think about, what do I have here? Got demand, got supply. The intersection obviously is the equilibrium. So the price initially is $5. And the question is, which represents the deadweight loss resulting from a $2 tax? We said that if you have a $2 tax, we can represent that as the supply curve being shifted up by the amount of the tax, because if we think about this original point on the supply curve, that point is telling you producers are willing to produce 200 units as long as they receive a $5 price. Well, if there's now a $2 tax they're going to have to pay, then they're going to have to get paid $7 in order to motivate them to produce that same quantity. So a $2 tax on the producers would shift the supply curve up by $2 or to the right, okay? And this vertical upward shift of the curve is the amount of the tax. Well, when supply shifts, you know what happens. That moves us to a new equilibrium, okay? And the new equilibrium, you can see here, is at this point, which is $6 and 150 units. Okay, we want to know, what is the deadweight loss resulting from this tax? Okay, well, we were going to be here. Okay, because of the tax, we have been moved back to 150. So the deadweight loss has to do with these last 50 units that are no longer going to be produced. The gain we could have gotten on those last 50, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus that we could have gotten, somebody could have enjoyed, we're going to lose that. Okay, so what would have the consumer surplus and producer surplus have been on those units? Well, remember, the gains from trade, it's always going to be the area below the demand curve. Okay, so we're looking at these last 50 units. So the value to consumers of those last 50 units would be the area under the demand curve. Okay, what was the cost of producing those last 50 units? Well, we said the cost is always represented by the area under the supply curve. Okay, so this big area is what those last 50 units were worth to consumers. The smaller area, red area, is what it costs the producers to produce those last units. So the gains that could have been achieved would be the difference between what those units were worth to consumers and what they cost producers. And so the gains on those last units would be these two, or this triangular area here, and I've covered it up, but this was area E, this was area F, okay? What do those represent? Those are the gains from trade that consumers and producers would have enjoyed if the quantity had remained at 200, but because of the tax, those last units don't get produced, and so we lose the gains we could have had. The answer then is E plus F. Number 3. Figure illustrates a market for gasoline with a $1 tax imposed on the buyers. Okay. Now, one of the principles that we saw in the chapter on taxes is that it really doesn't matter who pays the tax to the government. The incidence or the burden of the tax is who bears it depends on the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. But here it is the buyers who are actually having to give it to the government. And so demand started out here. Think about that point on the demand curve, $3 and $1,500. That means that there were consumers who were willing to pay at most $3 for that very last unit. Okay. Well, now that they're going to have to give the government $1 when they purchase it, they're not willing to produce as much, or they're not willing to buy as much. The most they're willing to pay for that last unit is $2. Okay. So that's where because of the tax, the demand curve has shifted down by the amount of the tax. Okay, just as supply, if the tax were on the producer, supply would shift up by the amount of the tax. Okay, so the tax shifts the demand curve down. Now that we know demand is shifting, we ask, well, where's the new equilibrium? And of course, always equilibrium is at the intersection of demand and supply. So we started out here. We're going to move to here. That is going to be the new equilibrium. It's going to be a quantity of 1,200, and the price is going to be $2.50. Now we have to be careful. What price do sellers receive for a gallon of gasoline in this market? Okay. The equilibrium was here. The sellers, before the tax, the buyers were paying $3 and the sellers were receiving $3. Okay. After the tax, the buyers are going to pay $2.50, okay, and the producers are going to receive $2.50. Okay, the cost, actually, I'm sorry, the buyers are actually going to be paying $3.50, but the producers are only going to get to keep $2.50. So the correct answer would be, let's see, what do sellers receive? They're going to receive a price of $2.50 for each unit that they sell. Okay. All right. Number 4. Okay. Let's see. Dishwashing detergent contains phosphates that harm marine life. Okay. In this figure, the market equilibrium quantity is how many units, and the efficient quantity is how many units. Okay. Notice the distinction here. This is a really important question. The distinction between the market equilibrium and the efficient quantity. Okay? Market equilibrium is always where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Okay? And if there are no externalities, no external benefits or no external costs, then that equilibrium will also be the efficient quantity. Okay? But if you have an externality of some kind, then the efficient quantity is going to differ from the equilibrium quantity. So let's look at the equilibrium first. Okay? This is the supply curve. The supply curve always shows you the marginal private cost. I forget exactly how your book labeled this, but it's the supply curve is showing you the marginal cost to the producer. It's not taking into account the external cost of due to the harm that this pollution is causing. Okay? There's an external cost. The SC is the social cost curve, and the marginal cost to society, okay, is equal to the marginal private cost plus the marginal external cost. All we have to do to take the external cost into account is to shift the marginal private cost curve up by the amount of the externality. Okay, so let's look at the first part. We want to know the market equilibrium. Well, that's just going to be at the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve. So that's going to be right here. Equilibrium price is going to be 9, and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 9 units as well. Okay, but to find the efficient quantity, okay, the efficient quantity is going to be where the marginal benefit to society, the marginal benefit, including all benefits, external and private, is just equal to the marginal cost to society, which is taking into account private cost and external cost. So to find the, again, for the market equilibrium, just look at the intersection of supply and demand. But for the efficient quantity, you're not going to use the supply curve because it doesn't take into account the externality. You're going to use the marginal social cost curve. Okay? Or another way to state this, that 9th unit, what is the benefit of that last unit to consumers? Well, it's $9. What is the cost of producing that 9th unit? Well, the cost to the producer is $9, but then there is this external cost, okay? And it looks like that external cost is about $6, okay? So that would indicate that the cost of producing that last unit was actually $15 when we take the externality into account. The benefit of consumers getting to enjoy that was only $9. So the 9th unit has a benefit that is a lot less than the cost, thinking in social terms. The benefit of that last unit is $9. The cost of that last unit was $15. Does it make any sense from an efficiency standpoint to produce a unit that's worth $9 at a cost of $15? That's inefficient. We don't want to produce that unit. We want to cut back and only produce those units that have a marginal benefit to society that is greater than or equal to the marginal cost to society. So from an efficiency standpoint, we don't want to produce here. We want to cut back to here. We want to produce only 6 units, because what's the benefit of that 6th unit? I'm reading up to the demand curve. It is worth $12 to some consumer. What's the cost of that 6th unit? Now, reading up to the supply curve, the cost to the producer is $6. The external cost due to the pollution is this extra $6. So that 6th unit is worth $12 to a consumer. It imposes a cost of $12 on society. So that is where we want to stop. Okay. All the previous units had a marginal benefit greater than the marginal social cost. So we do want to produce those. We do not want to produce these additional units here, because when we go beyond 6, the cost of those units is greater than the benefit from them. And that represents inefficiency. So the answer here was, let's see, we wanted the equilibrium and then the efficient. The equilibrium is 9, the efficient is 6. So that would be option B. Okay. Number 5, elasticity of supply. Which supply curve is the most elastic? You want to always remember, elasticity is a measure of what? It's a measure of sensitivity. Whether we're talking about demand elasticity or supply elasticity, it's a measure of sensitivity. If demand is highly elastic, that means if you have even a small change in price, consumers respond a lot. They change their quantity demanded a lot. If you have an elastic supply curve, it means if the price changes just a little bit, producers are willing to change their output a lot. Okay, and here S4 appears to be horizontal, which means producers are willing to produce, let's put a number, say 10,000 units. At the original price, say $8, they're willing to produce 10,000 units. But they are so sensitive to a price change that any tiny increase in the price, a minuscule increase, would motivate them to produce more. So essentially, at this $8 price, producers are willing to produce any quantity that consumers want to buy. Producers are very sensitive. The other extreme would be a supply curve that's very steep, very steep. Okay, and that means that even if you get a big increase in the price, you're going to only get a small percentage change in the quantity. Producers are not very sensitive to a price change if the supply curve is steep, and that means supply is very inelastic. For the horizontal demand or supply curve, then the elasticity would be essentially infinite. For a vertical supply curve, what would the elasticity be? It would be 0, because a vertical curve means there's no sensitivity of quantity supplied to a change in the price. Let's say the quantity here was 100 if the price were $1. A vertical curve would mean even if the price triples, goes up to $3, producers do not respond at all. They're going to continue to supply the same quantity. Okay? Vertical supply curve means perfectly inelastic. Steep supply curve means highly inelastic. Flat supply curve means very elastic. Okay? Number 6, dealing with foreign trade. What quantity would be imported? Well, first, you got to think about what does it mean to import a product. That means we are buying from foreign producers. Okay? So, question like this, really important to look at the graph and think about what the parts of the graph represent. Sometimes people just kind of freak out. They see the graph, they don't stop and think about the parts, and that's what you have to do. Only three curves here. Okay? Domestic supply, upward sloping. That shows domestic just means American producers. That curve is showing you how much American producers are willing to supply at each price. Domestic demand is showing us how much American consumers want to buy at each price. Okay? And then world supply is showing us how much producers are willing to supply and at what price they're willing to supply it. And the assumption we're making here is that the United States is a relatively small part of this market, and so we can buy as much as we want from other producers as long as we pay that market price. Okay, so let's think about what we can deduce from this graph. If one thing to ask is, well, if we did not have the opportunity to trade, what would happen? Okay. Well, then just eliminate the world supply, then obviously the equilibrium would be there, and the price would be $50. The quantity demanded and the quantity supplied would be 1,000 units. Consumers want to buy 1,000 units at that price, and American producers want to sell 1,000 units at that price. Okay, so now we understand what happens if there is no opportunity for foreign trade. But ask, well, now if we do open up our market to trade with other countries, and consumers find that they can buy as much as they want at $25 per a price of $25. Okay? Well, what would you do? You're an American consumer. You can buy from American producers at $50 or foreign producers at $25. Here we're assuming consumers are going to buy from whoever sells to them at the lowest price. So obviously, they're going to buy a lot of this output from foreign producers. But how much? Okay? How much? Well, the world price is 25. At that price, world producers outside of this country are willing to sell as much as people want to buy. Okay. At that $25 price, how much do American consumers want to buy? Well, read over to the demand curve. The quantity demanded is going to be 1,400. Okay. How do we determine the amount imported? Well, the amount imported will be the difference between what American producers supply and what American consumers want to buy. So at the price of $25, how much are American producers willing to supply? Well, we just read over to their supply curve. Okay? American producers, domestic production, it's going to be right here, 800. So American producers are producing 800. American consumers want 1,400. So since consumers want to buy 600 more than American producers are willing to supply, where does it come from? Well, it comes from foreign producers. The amount that will be imported is just the difference between the quantity that American consumers want to buy and the quantity that American producers want and are willing to sell. Okay, so that gap is going to be 600. Okay, for questions like this, if you approach it thinking, I'm just going to look at it and I'll see the answer, you're probably going to get it wrong. You have to stop. You have to think through each curve. think about, what do these numbers mean? If you do it one step at a time, it's not hard, but you have to do it one step at a time. You have to take your time, and don't expect the answer to just pop out at you, okay? You can get these questions right. You just have to remember how to think about it, okay? Number 7, also dealing with international trade. And here we have a tariff, okay? We want to know, what is the domestic quantity demanded? What is the domestic quantity supplied? Okay, well, this is just a tiny bit more complicated than the previous question. Take it one part at a time. You've got a domestic supply curve. That's how much the American producers are willing to supply. Got the domestic demand curve, okay? You got the world supply, and then you got a world supply with a tariff, okay? Let's forget about the world. If we did not have any foreign trade, what would happen? We would be at this intersection, and the price would be $9, okay? If we have opened up the market to trade, and we don't have a tariff, we just figured that out in the previous question. We said that the price would be right in here. It looks like about $5. And how much would American consumers want to buy? Well, they would want this quantity. How much would American producers want to sell? They would be willing to sell this quantity, and this vertical gap in between, or horizontal gap in between, would be the amount that would be imported. What we want to know here is, if the government has imposed a tariff, what is going to happen? Remember what a tariff is. It's a tax on foreign production. Right? So here, looks like the price was about $5. Americans could buy as much as they wanted at a price of $5 per unit. Now it looks like the price has gone up to about $8. So it looks like this is the result of a $3 tariff. Okay. How much will consumers want now with the tariff? Well, the price is going to be right here at 8. So at that price, read over to the demand curve, read down, and that is going to be the quantity demanded. And that's a little bit more than 9, so it looks like that's about 10. And let's see, we wanted to know the domestic quantity demanded. That's going to be 10. We also want to know the quantity supplied domestically. Now, again, at the new price of about $8, how much will producers want to supply? We read over to the domestic supply curve, we read down, and that gives us the domestic quantity supply, and that's a little bit below 9, so it looks like it's about 8. Okay, so our first part was 10, quantity supplied is 8, so that would be the answer here. Okay, what if this had asked what quantity will be imported? That's not hard to figure out. If American consumers are going to buy 10 and American producers are going to supply 8, where do those the difference, where does that come from? Well, that would be the amount of the amount that we're importing, okay, the foreign production that American consumers are buying. Okay, just, don't get in a rush. Take your time, think through the graph. You can get the right answer on these questions if you take your time. All right, number 8. At a price of $3. Let's look at the graph. Okay, we just got a demand curve, we got a supply curve, they intersect. What is the intersection? obviously it's equilibrium. Okay, so the equilibrium price is going to be 2. Equilibrium quantity is going to be 4. Okay. The question asks at a price of $3. Okay. Now that's not the equilibrium, but we're asked if the price is $3, what is the quantity supplied going to be? What is the quantity demanded going to be? And what is that going to give us? Okay. So I mean, this is a really, really easy question if you follow the right way of thinking through it. You say, if the price is 3, well, how much will consumers want to buy? You just read over to the demand curve, you read down, and you see the quantity demanded is 2. Okay? That's the number that goes here. And you also want to know the quantity supplied. Well, if the price is 3, how do you find the quantity supplied? You read over to the supply curve. You read down. Okay? Quantity supplied is 6. Okay, that's not hard. And we want to know, this leads to what? Okay, well, we've got quantity supplied of 6 units, quantity demanded of 2 units. Obviously, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. 6 is greater than 2. Okay? When we have more units being supplied than consumers want to buy, what do we call that? We call that, oops, we don't call it a shortage. We call that a surplus or excess supply. Producers are trying to sell, they're wanting to sell more at the current price than consumers are willing to buy. So they're going to have what is the amount of the surplus here? And that's an important thing to know. It's just the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, which graphically is represented here, and 6 minus 2 is 4. So here we have a surplus of 4 units. So we have, that would be, correct answer would be option C. Quantity supplied is 6, quantity demanded is 2, giving us a surplus of 4 units. Okay. Spend enough time going through questions like this, and you start to see that it's not rocket science. You can do it. You can do it. Number 9. Here we have a market with external costs. So this was what, chapter 8, I believe. Externalities. And here, these can be external benefits or external costs. Here, they're external costs. What does that mean? It means that when the product is produced, there's a cost incurred by the producer, but there's also an additional cost that somebody else is bearing. And our classic example of an external cost would be pollution, where the firm is bearing the cost of the workers it hires, the raw materials that it has to purchase, but the firm is not bearing the cost of that is created by the emission of chemicals into the environment that harms the community, but the firm is not bearing a cost as a result of using the environment in that way. And so in order to take into account these external costs, we have to remember that the marginal cost to society, taking all the costs into account, is the marginal cost, marginal private cost, which is the marginal cost to the producers, plus the marginal external cost. Okay, and here, notice it looks like the well, we don't have numbers, so there's some amount of external cost to go from the supply curve to the marginal social cost curve. All we have to do is add the amount of the externality to the supply curve. And that shifts the supply curve up by the amount of the externality. Okay. The equilibrium is always just at the intersection of demand and supply. So the equilibrium is here at Q1. Okay. The efficient quantity is always at the intersection of the, well, in this case, it's the intersection of demand and the marginal social cost curve, which is represented here. The efficient quantity is determined at that point because that is the point which shows that the marginal benefit of that last unit is just equal to the marginal social cost of that last unit. Let's say let's put it in some numbers. Let's say that this was $20. Okay. Why is Q3 the efficient quantity? Because if you read up to the demand curve, you see 20. That means the benefit to consumers of that last unit is $20. What is the cost of producing that last unit? Well, the cost to the producer was only down here. But for efficiency, we have to take into account the external cost as well. And that's what this point is telling us. That is also 20. So taking into account the external cost, that last unit when we're at Q3 is worth $20 to the consumer. It cost society $20 for that unit to be produced, and that means that is the last unit that we want produced. The equilibrium quantity is here at Q1. The efficient quantity is here at Q3. Okay. Now, so the efficient level of output is going to be Q3. Wait. Pause. Correction on that. I apparently was misreading the number here. That is Q0, not Q3. So the efficient quantity is Q0. And we also have to know the amount of the deadweight loss that occurs if we don't correct this externality. Remember, the deadweight loss is a measure of inefficiency that results either from a tax or from monopoly or from an externality. And so the efficient quantity is Q0. If we just left the market alone and we didn't do anything to correct for this externality, we would be at Q1. Okay? We would be overproducing, which means producing more than the efficient quantity. Anytime you have an external cost, the private market outcome is going to involve overproduction. Anytime you have an external benefit, the private market outcome is going to involve underproduction, less than the efficient quantity. Okay, so here, since this is an external cost, we're if the government doesn't do anything, we're going to be at Q1. Efficiency requires we be at Q0. Well, what is the inefficiency? What is the cost of producing this extra amount of output? Well, let's just think about what are those additional units between Q0 and Q1. What are they worth to consumers? And what do they cost society for them to be produced? And we always measure the benefits from a product by looking at the area under the demand curve. So these additional units, they're valuable to people, okay? And their value is the area under the demand curve between Q0 and Q1, okay? But we always have to look at what is the cost, whether we're talking about individuals or we're talking about society. We have to compare benefits to cost. The benefits of consuming these extra units would be the area under the demand curve. The cost of those extra units, taking into account the externality, would be this entire area below the marginal social cost curve between these two units. So it would be all of this area. Okay. Well, clearly, that area is bigger than the area we have in here. Okay. The cost to producing these extra units exceeds the benefit of those units by this area here. Okay. And what is that area? Well, the upper part was G, the lower part was H. So GH would be the our estimate of the dead weight loss due to this external cost, which means if the government doesn't do anything and we do have this overproduction, the loss to society would be represented by that area G plus H. And would also mean that if we can impose some type of a tax or something that will get us back to the efficient outcome, then the gain we would enjoy would be represented by G plus H. Okay. All right, number 10. Here, all we have is a demand curve. Based on the midpoint formula, we're only using one equation for elasticity, so they didn't really have to say midpoint. What is the elasticity of demand between $40 and $60? Remember, elasticity is a measure of how sensitive someone is to a change in the price of the product. Since we're looking at the elasticity of demand, we're looking at how sensitive consumers are to a change in the price of the product. What is our equation? The elasticity of demand. Okay. Important to remember this. Percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change in the price of the product. Okay. So here we're asking between a price of $40 and a price of $60. What is the percent change in quantity and the percent change in price? Well, to work that out, we have a little arithmetic. It's a little complicated, but it's not very bad. Okay, it's the percent change in the quantity demanded. Okay, well, if let's say we started at a price of $60, and we go to $40, that would mean we started at a quantity of 4, and we ended up with a quantity of 12. Okay, so the change in quantity would be 12 minus 4. Okay, but we want to express that as a percentage change. So we divide by the quantity, and we, for our quantity in the denominator here, we use the midpoint of this price range. So the midpoint between 60 and 40 would be 50. Okay, and then the denominator is this. So this is the numerator, and the denominator is the percent change in price over, the change in price over the price. So the denominator, we started at a price of 60, we ended up at a price of 40. So that's 40 minus 60. That's the price change over our average quantity, okay, which is, or our midpoint of this range, which is going to be, what, 8, okay? And I just realized I made a mistake. It's easy to do. What's the mistake? If you haven't seen it, stop the video and try to figure it out. Mistake is the numerator is the percent change in quantity demanded. The denominator is the percent change in price. I found the change in quantity. What should I have divided by here? Okay. Not 50, that's the price. I should have divided by the the quantity that was the midpoint between 4 and 12, which would have been 8. Okay, and then in the denominator, where I had the where we're dealing with price, that's going to be 40 minus 60, and then the for the denominator here, what do you use? You use the midpoint between 40 and 60, which is 50. Okay. Of course, I actually made that mistake on purpose just to see if you would catch it. Not really, but so to work this out, the rest of the way, you've got 8 over 8 over minus 20 over 50. Remember we said for the price elasticity of demand, it's always going to come out negative, but we just ignore the negative sign. So you don't have to worry about whether you put 60 minus 40 or 40 minus 60. You do have to make sure you put quantity in the numerator and price in the denominator, but the sign doesn't really matter. So you get 8 over 8 is 1. And in the denominator, you get 20 divided by 40, or by 50, that's 0.4. Okay. In percentage terms, think about what this means. Okay. 1 is 100%. 0.4 is 40%. Okay. So what's really happened here is a 40% change in the price has caused a 100% change in the quantity demanded. And the elasticity is just what we get when we divide 100% by 40%, which is 2.5. So this is going to be the correct answer. And what would we call that demand? Elastic or inelastic? We'd say it's very elastic, because anytime the elasticity coefficient is greater than 1, we call it elastic, and 2 is a lot greater than 1. 2.5 means that for every 1% change in the price, the quantity demanded doesn't just change by 1%, it's going to change by 2.5%. So this indicates that consumers are very responsive to a price change over this interval that we're looking at. Okay. Minimum wage. At a minimum wage of $8, firms are willing to hire how many workers? Okay. Look at the graph. Think about what the curves mean. Demand shows you the quantity of labor that employers will demand, the number of workers they will hire at different wage rates. Okay. If the wage is 8, they're going to employ 25 people. If it's only 6, they're going to employ 35. Okay. What we want to know is, if the minimum wage is 8, how many workers will firms want to hire? Okay. So what is a minimum wage? It means that firms cannot employ workers and pay them less than that. This is an example of a price floor. If the wage is $8, then we're going to be here. And the quantity that will be employed will be 25. And so the number that firms will be willing to hire will be 25. Excuse me. Now, while we're looking at this, there are other questions, very similar questions that could be asked. Could say, well, how many people will be willing to work at a wage rate of a minimum wage of $8? And you would just go over to the supply curve, you read over to here, you read down, quantity supplied would be 45. That's the number of workers who want a job. They're looking for a job at a minimum wage of $8. The quantity demanded would be only 25. So here, given these numbers, we could say, what does that gap represent? That gap represents the number of workers who will be unemployed, who will not be able to find a job given the minimum wage of $8. Okay? The higher the minimum wage, the more unemployed workers you're going to have. Okay? But to answer this question, you didn't have to go through all of that. Always be sure to read the question carefully, because there are different ways that questions can be asked. What's the quantity demanded? What's the quantity supplied? How many unemployed workers will there be? You got to read it carefully so that you know what it's actually asking. Number 12. We got a demand curve, we got a supply curve. It's pretty straightforward. If the price of the product is 14, okay, what's going to happen? Okay, well, before you're going to look at that, notice where's the equilibrium? Well, it's always at the intersection, and that is at a price of $16. Okay, so if the price were 16, then the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied would be equal. Here we're told the price is actually 14. So notice the price is below the equilibrium. That should, give you a hint as to what's going to happen, but work through it anyway. At this price, how many units will consumers want to buy? How do we find that? We read over to the demand curve. We read down. 130 is the quantity demanded. Okay. At that same price, how many units will producers be willing to supply? Now read over to the supply curve, read down. That gives us the quantity supplied. That's going to be 80. So you've got consumers wanting 130, producers being willing to supply only 80. So that horizontal gap there of 50 units is what? Excess demand or excess supply? It's excess demand. Is it a shortage or a surplus? You say shortage, because people are trying to buy more than is going to be available. So producers will sell all that they have, and there's still going to be consumers wanting to buy 50 units that are not going to be available. Okay. So what was the correct answer? It's going to be a shortage of 50 units, the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. Shortage of 50. Okay, so those two parts are right. And the price will rise to $16. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, when we have a shortage, what does that lead to? That tells the producers you can raise your price and still sell as much as you want to sell. And so how far will the price rise? It's going to go to the equilibrium, which is at $16. Okay, D is the correct answer. Number 13. Tax imposed on sellers. According to the figure, the price that buyers pay after the tax is imposed is. All right, look at the graph. Think about the graph. Here's the demand curve. Here's the supply curve before the tax. Okay. When you impose a tax on the producers, that is essentially an increase in their cost. So the supply of that product is going to decrease, which means an upward shift of the supply curve by the amount of the tax. Okay. When you shift the supply curve up, where's the new equilibrium? Well, it was here. It moves to here. The equilibrium price was $4. It goes up to $4.40. That is the price that consumers are going to have to pay. So So what do we want to know? There are different ways a question like this could be worded. So think about it carefully. According to the figure, the price that buyers pay after the tax is imposed. Buyers are going to pay $4.40. So that is going to be the correct answer. But what if the question were worded a little bit differently? What if it asked, what is the price that producers will receive, the price they get to keep after the tax is imposed? What would the answer to that be? Okay. It's a $1 tax. The price goes up by up to $4.40. Okay. Consumers are going to pay $4.40. Producers get $4.40, but do they get to keep it all? No, they have to give $1 to the government. So the producers get $4.40, then they give $1 to the government, and that means the price that the producers will get to keep will only be $3.40. Question didn't ask for that, but a similar question could be worded that way. 14. According to the figure, what is the tax revenue that the government collects from the tax on gadgets? Okay, this is very similar to the previous question, but it asks for something a little bit different. Okay, where was the original equilibrium? It was right here, and that's the demand curve. That's the supply with no tax. We impose the tax, supply shifts up, which is a decrease in supply. Where's the new equilibrium? It's right there. The price that consumers pay is $5.50. That is the amount that is given to the producer. But then here, this is it's like a $1 tax. And the difference between the two curves there is $1. So the producers get $5.50, but then they have to give $1 to the government. So the government is going to get $1 in tax revenue for each unit that is sold. How many units are going to be sold? Okay, 350 units. So the government's tax revenue is just going to be the amount of the tax times the quantity. The amount of the tax is represented here. 550 minus 450, that is $1, times 350 units. So the government is going to get $350 in tax revenue. So that would be answer A. Number 15. Really important question. The marginal cost of the fifth unit of output is. Okay. You know what marginal cost is, and you take your time. This is a simple question. Okay, but refresh your memory. Marginal cost. What's the definition? Marginal cost is just the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. It is the extra cost the firm incurs when they choose to produce an extra unit. And which extra unit are we talking about? Here we're talking about the fifth unit. So what we're really asking is, if the firm was producing 4 and they decide to expand and produce 1 more, what happens to their total cost? Okay. What is the change in total cost that occurs? So we got to be careful that we read the graph correctly. Okay. Total cost was $230. When they expand and they produce 1 more unit, their total cost goes from $230 up to $300. And the change in total cost there is $70. So that would be the correct answer. That is not a hard question if you remember what marginal cost is and you think through what these numbers represent. If you just look at it and take a guess, then it's a pretty hard question, but you can get that right. Number 16, a deadweight loss. Remember what we said. We said the deadweight loss is the measure of inefficiency caused by a monopoly, caused by an externality, or caused by a tax. Okay, and here the correct answer is going to be option D. Okay, it's the lost consumer and producer surplus. Okay, something we could have had, but we lose if all mutually profitable gains from trade are not exploited. Okay? If we have if we're talking about a tax, we impose a tax on the producers, just like in the previous example. What happens because of the tax? The quantity decreases. Okay? And these, let's say this was 200 units and this was 150 units. Well, these last 50 units are worth more to the consumer than they cost the producer to produce. The cost of producing these last 50 units would be represented by that area. The benefit to consumers of those last 50 units would be the area under the demand curve, which would be all of this. Well, clearly, the benefits, this big area, is greater than the cost. Those last 50 units, if they are produced, they provide a benefit, a net benefit to consumers and producers. And the benefit of those last 50 units is this area here. If we impose the tax, then we lose that benefit that we could have had. That's the deadweight loss. Number 17. A rent control is a regulation. Okay. What does it do? Well, a rent control, we talked about in chapter 8. We talked about a price ceiling and a price floor. Think about the examples we used. For a price floor, we said a minimum wage is a price floor. A price floor is a minimum legal price. It's where the government is saying you cannot charge less than this amount. Okay? A price ceiling is a maximum legal price. A rent control is a ceiling. It's where the government is telling producers, telling landlords, you cannot charge more than this amount. Okay? Let's look at all these. A rent control controls rents at constant and affordable levels. Okay, affordable. What does that mean? That's totally subjective. Bill Gates could afford $10,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. Okay? If you see affordable, you'd be pretty sure it's not the right answer. Prevents rents from rising to equilibrium levels. Okay? You've got, this is the market, and the rent for a certain kind of level of apartment is $900. A rent control would be a ceiling where the government is telling producers, you can't charge $900. We're only going to let you charge $700, something below the equilibrium. So B would be a correct answer. Let's look at C. A rent control is a regulation that ensures that there are apartments available for rent. Actually, no, it does exactly the opposite, because by keeping the rent below the equilibrium, it ensures that there will be a shortage. It doesn't ensure that there will be apartments available for rent. It ensures that the quantity that will be available will be less than the quantity that people want. Okay? Very important to recognize that a shortage of apartments is caused by rent control. We understand this. It makes you wonder, why does the government continue to impose rent control in lots of cities? And it's just because people don't understand basic economics. And D, upholds rents to above equilibrium levels. No, rent control is keeping the rent below the equilibrium. Number 18, a blank causes the equilibrium price to something and the quantity to something. Okay, so here you're going to have to look at each one of these. And notice each option has to do with what's happening to the price and what's happening to the quantity. Look at A. And just work through each one of these and see, is it right? Don't look for something that looks plausible. Work through it. Okay? Work through every option and see which one is correct. An increase in demand. What does that mean? That means a rightward shift of the curve. What does that do? It moves us from this equilibrium to this equilibrium. Quantity goes up and the price goes up. A says an increase in demand will cause the price to rise and the quantity to fall. No, that's not right. A decrease in demand. Okay, well, what would that do? That would be a leftward shift of the demand curve. Okay? Equilibrium would move from here to there. Quantity would fall and the price would fall. So a decrease in demand would cause price to fall, quantity to rise. No, that's not right. It takes a while to go through some of these, but if you are willing to do the work, you'll get the right answer. C, decrease in supply. So if you don't draw the graph, you're going to make mistakes. You've got to draw here, you got to draw 4 graphs. C, decrease in supply. What does that mean? It means that supply is shifting to the left or up. Okay. Equilibrium was here, it moves to here. Quantity goes down, price goes up. C says a decrease in supply causes the price to go up, causes quantity to fall. That's exactly what we've seen happens. So you don't guess, you're just looking at your graph and seeing which of these actually happens. And then go ahead and check the other one as well, just to make sure you haven't made a mistake. Draw the graph. An increase in supply. Well, that means the supply curve is going to shift, and it's going to shift to the right. It's an increase in that for every price, the quantity supplied by producers is greater now than before. And what does it do? It moves us from here, this equilibrium, to this equilibrium. And what happens to the price? It goes down. And what happens to the quantity? It goes up. Okay. Increase in supply. Supply causes the price to rise. No, it causes it to go down. But that is not correct. So option C is the only correct answer. A question like this does require you to do a lot of work, but it's not hard work. If you take it one step at a time, you will get the right answer. It's not guesswork. Number 19. Consider a competitive industry, okay, that is in long-run equilibrium. Now you should ask, long-run equilibrium in a competitive industry, what does that mean? What is a competitive industry? It's an industry where we got lots of firms where each is small relative to the total. So each says, I'm a price taker. I cannot affect the price. I have to take the prices given. Firms are selling identical products, okay? And most importantly, in a competitive industry, it means that barriers to entry are very low. It's very easy for new firms to come in. And as a result, in a competitive industry, anytime if the price is above average cost, what does that tell you firms are earning? They're earning positive profits. And what does positive profit mean? It means that firms in this industry are doing better than they could do elsewhere. They're doing better than firms in other industries. So anytime you have positive economic profits being earned in a competitive industry, that's going to lead to what? It's going to lead to entry. It's going to lead to entry, okay? And when you have new firms coming in, that's going to push the price down. And as the price goes down, then eventually it falls so far it's equal to average cost. And if price equals average cost, what does that tell you about profit? Profit has been pushed down to 0. We're dealing here with a competitive industry that is in long-run equilibrium, which means that they're starting out with 0 profit. Suppose there's a large and permanent increase in the demand for this good, okay? So we're starting out this is the industry. And then you can think about the situation as represented or as faced by the representative firm. Each firm says, I can sell as much as I want, as long as I charge the equilibrium price. Okay? And each firm says, my marginal revenue is just equal to that price. Okay? Each firm is going to have a marginal cost curve that's going to look like that. Each individual firm is going to choose the quantity that will give it maximum profit, and that's going to be right here. Let's call that Q star. So we're starting out where you got some number of firms, each is producing this amount of output. In total, they are producing the quantity that consumers want to buy, okay? And since this is long-run equilibrium, how much profit are they earning? 0. So that would mean the situation initially looks like this. And what are we assuming happens? There's a large and permanent increase in demand. Okay? So if demand increases, it's a rightward shift of the curve. What happens? Equilibrium moves from here to there. The price goes up. And now each price taker says, I can now charge a higher price. My new demand curve, my new marginal revenue curve is up here. Each firm wants to maximize its profits. It's going to do so by producing here where MR equals MC. And now at this new higher quantity, okay, the firm's price is here. Its average cost is down here. This firm, this representative firm, is making a profit. So which of these is going to be correct? Existing firms will face lower sunk cost. Well, that's not really relevant. Existing firms' average cost curves will shift upward. No, there's no reason for that to happen. Firms will enter the industry because the price will rise. The price is going to go up. We saw that individual firms increase their output. We saw they are making profit now. And what does that profit lead to? that leads to more entry. So the price goes up and there will be entry into this industry. Ultimately, this is what happens in the short run. Ultimately, as these new firms enter, the supply would shift to the right and the price would go back down. If it's a constant cost industry, it would go all the way back down to the original price. If it's an increasing cost industry, then the price would not go all the way back to where it started. All right, number 20. Economic policies of protectionism. Okay? The idea of protectionism is that the government is doing something to protect American producers. Notice they're not protecting American consumers. They're protecting American producers at the expense of American consumers. And this generally comes in two main forms. A tariff, okay? A tariff, we said that is a tax on foreign producers. So if you're an American auto producer and a lot of your customers start buying from foreign car makers, well, it's pretty easy to see why, if the government imposes a tax on those foreign producers that you don't have to pay, that's going to make the foreign cars more expensive. It's going to protect you, but what's going to happen to the customers? Okay? The American customers, they're going to be hurt because they end up having to pay higher prices. So tariffs are a means of protectionism. Also, quotas. A quota is where the government says, okay, we're not going to impose a tariff. We will impose a quota. We'll let a certain quantity of, say, foreign cars come in, but we're going to limit it to 50,000 or 100,000. Okay? And that will provide protection to the American producers. It will cause the American consumers to be hurt because they're going to have to pay higher prices. Protectionism would not include reduced trade barriers. Protectionism would include the opposite, include increased trade barriers. Correct answer then would be 2 plus 3. So that would be B. Okay, let's take a break for a moment.